Welcome in this time of contemplation and self reflection that is Lent, as we take our first steps down the way of woes, as I am calling it. So, in Matthew 23, Jesus describes a series of actions and attitudes introduced by the repeating phrase, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." And just as we should try to study the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 as examples of habits and attitudes to cultivate, I think we also need to take a hard look at this way of woes in Matthew 23 to learn to recognize in ourselves and in others the habits and attitudes that lead into perhaps the most pervasive and tempting of all failures of human nature, which is hypocrisy. And, what better time to do this than during Lent, the season that we have as a church set aside to take a hard look at ourselves, at humanity, and to really come to terms with what is working and what is not working in our own personal lives and in our societies. So, first, let's take some background information on this passage to understand it a little bit better. The repeated refrain in this passage is, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," which begs the question, who or what are these scribes and Pharisees? So, there's a lot of nuance here. To what degree the scribes and the Pharisees as a whole deserve the negative reputation they have inherited in Western civilization, particularly in the New Testament, is again, it's nuanced and it is a much, much larger discussion. What matters for right now is this. The scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and sometimes Jews that are mentioned in the gospel as entire groups. This is a shorthand reference to the religious and scholarly elites of that day and age. And it is important to note that when Jesus and his followers and then the early Christians speak in general terms of these groups of people, they are speaking of the powerful, dominant religious groups of their time and culture, as opposed to their own small, persecuted religious minority. And so, with this fact in mind, the criticisms in the Gospels of the Pharisees, etc., they appear in their proper light. The point of the Pharisees equal hypocrites passages, etc., the point was not to promote anti-Semitism or religious hostility or hatred of any kind. These passages come from the weaker minority group, the Christians, and they are used to explain why the weaker minority group found it necessary to break ranks with their persecutors in the first place. And the first reason to break ranks with these religious and scholarly elites, at least according to Jesus in the Gospels, appears to be their demonstrated hypocrisy. So, one more time, because it is important, scribes and Pharisees refers to the religious and scholarly elites of Jesus's time. And so, with that in mind, let's take those first steps into the way of woes, a journey that I intend to be challenging. I intend to be introspective, as Lent is meant to be, but also ultimately, I do not intend it to be a source of woe, but rather a source of grace, the grace to recognize what is broken in this world and why, and how these things might be fixed. So, this is the first of a four-part series. Each week, each of the next 4 weeks in Lent, another part will come out. And today, the verses will be read aloud 3 times. And between each reading, I will add certain pieces of information, things that occur to me, things that I know from history, etc. And between each reading, I will suggest to you another aspect or another take on these verses to keep in mind or keep your focus on. And so, focusing now on the people Jesus is speaking about as the religious and scholarly elite, that religious and scholarly elite that I was talking about, the people who hold authority and influence and power over and in their communities, hear these first steps along the way of woes. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you traveled the land and the sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell, Gehenna, the land of destruction, as yourselves. Matthew 23:13-15. So the word that stands out to me on our first read through here is devour. For you devour widows' houses. It's particularly interesting because verse 14, for you devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. This phrase, this verse, does not appear in certain ancient texts of the Gospel Matthew. Now, what does that mean? So, all, the questions of authority and divine inspiration in the Bible, things I do believe in aside, Matthew is an ancient document. It was written pre-computer, pre-printer, pre-fountain pen, and pre-copyright law, actually. And so every ancient copy of the book of Matthew was written out by hand, and mistakes were made. Words and whole verses are sometimes deleted and sometimes also added. Some ancient copies of Matthew, verse 23:14, in some of the ancient copies, that verse simply does not exist. And now, was this verse accidentally deleted from that copy, or was it added to later copies? The truth is, we don't know. We never will know. And it is worth pointing out, though, that 23:14 does kind of interrupt the conversation that's in progress, right? So verse 13 is about salvation. It's about not letting people into the kingdom of heaven. And then verse 15 is about salvation, about traveling the seas to win converts. But between those two verses is this statement in verse 14 about defrauding widows. And it interrupts the flow. It feels like it was not originally there. And yet, the more I think about it, the more I think it sums up the entire point, the hypocrisy that we are talking about in these verses. The hypocrisy in these verses is devouring. Yeah. The hypocrites in these verses are the ones who, in the name of righteousness and goodness and salvation, devour others for their own gain. And so think about it. Think about all of that. Keep in mind this idea of the scribes and Pharisees as devourers as we read through the passage again. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one convert, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell, Gehenna, or the land of destruction, as yourselves. Matthew 23:13 through 15. So, what does it mean to be the devourer? The second word that stands out to me in these verses is the word Gehenna. When Jesus calls the hypocrites, he's talking about sons of Gehenna. And I promise I did not just change the subject there, because the concepts of Gehenna and devouring are, in fact, related. Now, Gehenna, so depending on which translation of the Bible you are reading from, the translator might have left the word Gehenna as it is. It is a Hebrew word. The translator might have translated it as hell or destruction, or as I have extrapolated it a bit, the land of destruction. And Gehenna, where the term comes from and what it represents in Jewish literature, and then later in early Christian literature, it is a really fascinating topic, at least if you're me. I think I dedicated an entire chapter of my master's thesis to Gehenna, or at least a large section of that chapter. Gehenna is essentially hell. And unlike the Greek term Hades, which we are probably more familiar with in this day and age, but unlike the Greek term Hades, which is just the underworld, just the land of the dead, Hades is a place that may or may not involve punishment. But Gehenna is much more similar to the contemporary concept we have of hell. It is overtly a place for the wicked. It is a place of punishment, and specifically, it is a place of fire. But what's most interesting about Gehenna as a concept is that the meaning of it, the imagery, is born out of the real world and out of real history. The idea of Gehenna is based on a real place. It's a valley outside the city of Jerusalem, and it's where a few things reportedly happened. And one of those things was sacrifices to foreign gods, that is blood sacrifices, child sacrifices, reportedly. And we're talking about foreign gods like this entity known in the Old Testament as Molech. And as far as we can tell, Molech appears to be some kind of code name, actually. It's related, first of all, to the Hebrew word for king, which is melech. And we don't know of any actual god who was actually named Molech in any of the nations around Israel or Judah, ancient Israel and Judah. And that doesn't mean there wasn't one, but it's likely this was actually a code name for the king of sorry, that's a typo in my script. But it's likely this was actually a code name for the kind of foreign god who would require human sacrifices, particularly child human sacrifice. It's likely the name itself is meant to be some kind of distortion or mutilation of the idea of kingship, righteous kingship, and God's kingship over Israel and Judah. But regardless of whether Moloch is a distorted code name or if it's a god we just haven't found any evidence for yet. The phrase that is used to describe these human sacrifices that took place outside the city of Jerusalem, sacrifices which God, the true God, found so abhorrent, the phrase used to describe them is pass through fire. So, for example, in Jeremiah 32, verse 35, Jeremiah states, "And they built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire of Molech, which I, God, did not command them, nor did it come to my mind that they should do this abomination." And that valley of Hinnom is thought to be the origin of the word Gehenna. So you can see the concept developing even early on, well before the idea of hell as we know it today existed in human literature. Still, we see this concept developing of this place of death made evil by the passing through or the sacrifice of children by fire to an evil god. And again, I promise you that I was not changing the subject because what is one of the most common descriptors given for fire, right? Fire is something that is said to devour. So, particularly in symbolism, fire devours evil and the wicked. So, put it all together and what does this mean? Particularly this passage, these three first steps along the way of woes. What does all of this mean? We will read the passage one more time. And as we do, so keep in mind that theme which links verses 13 and 15, the theme of salvation. Shutting up the kingdom of heaven that is denying salvation to the people that you are responsible for teaching, while at the same time searching the entire world for people to convert to your way of thinking about salvation. And think if you can, see if you can spot any correlations between all this talk of denied salvation and this image of a devouring fire. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For neither you go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour women's houses and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one convert. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourselves. Matthew 23, 13 through 15. So we have come to the end of the guided part of our study today. And here at the end, it turns to you, to your own introspection, your own thoughts. And I have here just imparting a few questions to maybe guide the way. So, first, how many times in history have we encountered these kinds of leaders? The leaders who say, I have the answers, the leaders who beckon this way to salvation, but then never actually follow through. Leaders who, instead of doing the hard work to fulfill that promise to make life better, just take our trust, our faith, and our work, consume us, devour us, to serve their own goals, to make their lives better, and make themselves look better. Now, how many leaders throughout history have been more concerned with appearances, with appeasing the elites of the world, than with saying or doing what needs to be done to get things done? How many leaders have there been throughout history who are more interested in looking like peacemakers than in actually ending wars? That's the easy part, the easy set of questions, honestly. Next is the hard part, because I think we're all very good at finding fault with our leaders, but what about ourselves? What might in what ways might you consume others? Does the appearance of having the right answer ever matter more to you than having the right answer? What promises do you make that are impossible to keep? Promises like, I know what I'm doing, I know what you should do, just follow me. So, know as we do conclude things here today, know that no answer to any of these questions makes you an evil person. I think we all do devour other people from time to time in one circumstance or another. We all, I think, use others to our own ends. We all make impossible promises. And I think at least most of us will go to great lengths, do everything in our power to cover up and hide our own inadequacies. The point in asking and answering these questions is not to blame ourselves or hate ourselves. The point is to recognize ourselves, our reality, who we truly are, and do better next time. The point is to learn to recognize the things that are not easy to see, to recognize righteousness, and to recognize hypocrisy, and to do better next time, because that is all that we can do. And it is, fortunately, all that the Lord does require of us.